It's the light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. It's the light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. It's the light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
해피 뉴 이어. 네, 2021년 새해가 밝았습니다. 또 새해가 밝은 만큼 제가 기도하고 우리 2021년 첫 번째 예배를 드리도록 하겠습니다. 기도하겠습니다. 하나님 감사합니다. 이렇게 우리 2021년 새해를 우리 모두에게 더해주시면 감사합니다. 하나님, 특별히 2021년은 이러한 해가 되길 원합니다. 우리가 조금은 더 주님을 알길 원하는 해가 되길 원합니다. 우리가 조금은 더 주님을 닮아가는 해가 되길 원합니다. 우리가 조금은 더 주님을 찬양하고 말씀을 사모하고 기도하는 해가 되길 원합니다. 우리가 조금은 더 주님을 뜨겁게 사랑하는 해가 되길 원합니다. 하나님, 우리 소망부 친구들 한 사람 한 사람, 그리고 우리 학부모님들, 우리 교사 선생님, 우리 목사님까지 하나님께서 20년도를 우리 모두 건강하게 지켜주신 것처럼 2021년도 지켜주시고, 무엇보다도 우리가 더욱더 주님을 사랑하는 한 해가 될 수 있도록 하나님 함께 하시고 붙들어 주시옵소서. 하나님, 특별히 2021년에는 우리가 다시 모여 예배를 드리길 원합니다. 하나님, 하루빨리 주님께서 허락하시는 그 날에 우리가 모여 예전처럼 예배 드릴 수 있게 하시고, 그렇게 예배 드리는 날에는 우리가 정말 함께 기뻐 춤추며 주님 앞에 나아갈 수 있도록 하나님 함께 하시고 붙들어 주시옵소서. 하나님, 이번 한 해도 주님 앞에 드립니다. 하나님, 우리의 삶을 드립니다. 함께하여 주시옵소서. 주님 감사하며 사랑합니다. 이 모든 말씀 우리를 너무나도 사랑하시는 예수님의 이름으로 축복하며 기도드렸습니다. 아멘. 끝.
아름다운 마음들이 모여서 주의 은혜 나누며 할렐루야. 예수님을 따라 사랑해야지. 우리 서로 사랑해. 하나님이 가르쳐준 한 가지, 내 이웃을 내 몸과 같이 사랑해.
Happy New Year, brothers and sisters. Today we'll be watching a video on the book of Joshua, which breaks down the literary design of the book and its flow of thoughts. In Joshua, after Moses' death, Joshua leads Israel and they settle in the promised land currently occupied by Canaanites.
The book of Joshua. Let's back up and remember the story so far. So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. And so through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and he brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died, and Israel's ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with four main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land, and then once they're there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites, and so they engage them in battle. Then after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, and then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. So let's dive in and we'll see how all of it flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death, and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. And the author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. So like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that they were given at Mount Sinai. And then Joshua sends spies into the land, just as Moses did back in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, except it goes way better this time. In fact, even some Canaanites turn and follow the God of Israel. Joshua then leads all Israel across the Jordan River and into the land. Just like the sea parted for Moses in the Exodus, so here the river Jordan parts and the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant across, leading all Israel with them. Now, in chapter 5, the story transitions. So the people look back to their roots as God's covenant people, and so the new generation is circumcised and they celebrate their first Passover in the land. But then they turn and prepare to go forward. And Joshua has this crazy encounter with a mysterious warrior, who, it turns out, is the angelic commander of God's army. And Joshua asks, "Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" And the warrior responds, "Neither," which shows that the real question here is whether Joshua is on God's side. It makes clear that this whole story is not about Israel versus the Canaanites. Rather, this is God's battle, and Israel is going to play the role of spectators or sometimes supporters in God's plan, which leads to the next section. We find stories about all these conflicts that Israel had with different Canaanite groups. And the first part retells the story of two battles in detail, and that's followed by a series of short stories that condense years of battles into a few brief summaries. So the first two battles are against Jericho and then Ai, and they offer these contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. At Jericho, Israel is to take a completely passive approach. So they let God's presence in the ark lead them around the city to music for 6 days. And just like Rahab turned to the God of Israel, maybe the people of Jericho would do the same, but they don't. And so on the 7th day, the priests blow the trumpets and the walls come falling down, leading Israel to victory. The point of the story is that God is the one who will deliver his people. Israel simply needs to trust and wait. Now, the next story of the battle at Ai makes the opposite point. So there's this Israelite named Achan, and he steals from Jericho some of the devoted goods that were to belong to God alone, and then he lies about it. It's a pretty lame move after all that God has done for Israel. And so Israel goes into battle with the city of Ai, and they're totally defeated. And it's only after humble repentance and severely dealing with Achan's sin that Israel gains victory. And so together, these two stories, they're placed right up front to make an important point. If Israel is going to inherit the land, they have to be obedient and trust in God's commands. They don't get special treatment. Now, the second part of this section begins with the Gibeonites, a Canaanite people group, and they do just what Rahab did as they turn to follow the God of Israel and they make peace with Israel. This is in contrast to all of these other Canaanite kings who start to form alliances and coalitions, and they want to destroy Israel. So Israel engages them in battle, and they win by a landslide. And so this whole section concludes with this summary list of all of these victories won by Moses and then by Joshua. Now, let's stop for a second, because odds are that these stories and the violence in them, they're going to bother you. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're bound to wonder, like, didn't Jesus say to love your enemies? Why is God declaring war here? So first, why the Canaanites? The main reasons are actually given earlier in the biblical story. It's that the culture of the Canaanites had become extremely morally corrupt, especially when it comes to sex. Go check out Leviticus chapter 18. And they also widely practiced child sacrifice. Go see Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so God didn't want these practices to influence Israel. The Canaanites had to go. Which raises the second question. Did God actually command the destruction of all the Canaanites, like a genocide? So at first glance, you look at the phrases used in these stories. They totally destroyed them. They left no survivor or anything that breathed. But when you look a second time more closely, you'll see that these phrases are clearly hyperbole and not literal. So go back to the original command about the Canaanites in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Israel is first told to drive out the Canaanites, but then to totally destroy them. And then that's followed by commands to not intermarry with them or enter into business deals with them. So you can't marry someone that you've destroyed. I think you get the point. The same idea applies to the stories in Joshua. Look closely. So for example, we're told in Joshua chapter 10 that Israel left no survivors in the cities of Hebron or Debir. But then later in chapter 15, we see these towns and they're still populated by Canaanites. And so what we're seeing is that Joshua fits in with other ancient battle accounts by using non-literal hyperbolic language as part of the narrative style. And so the word genocide doesn't actually fit what we see here, especially in light of the stories about the Canaanites who did turn to the God of Israel, like Rahab or the Gibeonites. God was open to those who would turn to him. The last thing to think about is that these stories mark a unique moment in Israel's history. These battles were limited to the handful of people groups living in the land of Canaan. With all other nations, Israel was commanded by God to pursue peace. Go read Deuteronomy chapter 20. So the purpose of these battle stories was never to tell you, the reader, to go commit violence in God's name. Rather, they show God bringing his justice on human evil at a unique moment in history and how he delivered Israel from being annihilated by the Canaanites. Now, let's go back to the book's design. After years of battles, we see an aging Joshua, and he starts dividing up the land for the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of this section is like lists of boundary lines. And let's be honest, it's kind of boring. It's like reading a map that has no pictures. But for the Israelites, these lists were super important. This was the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham that his descendants would inherit the promised land. And so now it was all coming to pass right down to the detail, which leads to the final section. Joshua gives two speeches to the people that are very similar to the final speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites. And so he calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods and be faithful to the covenant they made. If they do, it will lead to life and blessing in the land. But if they're unfaithful, Israel will call down on itself the same divine judgment that the Canaanites experienced. They'll be kicked off the land into exile. And so Joshua leaves Israel with a choice. What is Israel going to do? That's the big question that looms as the story ends, and that's the book of Joshua.
way, He's my everything. Every single moment of every single day, there's something deep within me I just gotta say, 'cause I'm gonna praise you, Lord, every day of my life. 'Cause you give me freedom and it makes me shout, makes me get up and dance, get up and dance. Come on everybody, are you ready to sing? 'Cause Jesus is the way, He's my everything. 'Cause every single moment of every single day, there's something deep within me I just gotta say, 'cause I'm gonna praise you, Lord, every day of my life. 'Cause you give me freedom and it makes me shout, it makes me get up and I'm gonna praise you, Lord, every day of my life. 'Cause you give me freedom and it makes me shout, it makes me get up. 'Cause all the boys in the room, put your hands like you're ready to go.
Hi everyone! Today we're gonna make a box with paper. I already created a small box. So what we have to prepare is just the colored paper that you like. And let's get started. So we're gonna fold the paper in a half diagonally, unfold it, and then do the same way on the other side. Unfold it, and then now we're gonna fold it in a half. Also do the same thing. Now we're gonna fold all four edges to touch the center. Now we're going to do another fold that touches just the middle line. Do the same way for the other side. Also on this side too. Now we are ready to build a box. So first thing we have to do is we're gonna fold this part that we already folded and do another fold that also touches this middle line. Hold this part and then fold this side, then fold it inside so that it goes to this inside of the box. Make sure it stands well, and then do the same thing this side. Now, this is the box made with paper. So you can put coins inside, or any other stuff that you like to put in. Bye!
My friends, this is my blessings for you today. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen.
수학호 친구들